Okay, this is part 8. We are on slide 9 of lecture 17, chapter 12, eukaryotes 2. We're going to look at the 3 different kinds of important helminth in view of identifying them and in view of showing some examples. So our first kind of helminth is a roundworm or a nematode. Now, nematode is the phylum. So if we are sticking with the kingdom system, phylum is the next big division under kingdom. So the nematodes are a very large group of organisms. There are many, many different kinds of nematodes. And they are called roundworms because of their round body plan. So all of our worms have this long cylindrical, typically body configuration, but when you chop through them and you get what's called a cross section, you see different shapes and different structures in the worms. So when you do chop through a nematode, you get a round cross section. The nematode has a digestive tract that extends all the way from the mouth to the anus. It's called a complete digestive tract. Now it sounds, you may think that, well, that's kind of typical, but it's actually not. There are many animals that don't have a complete digestive tract. In fact, when we look at tapeworms, we will see that they don't have that. There are many nematodes that are not parasitic. That I would say the majority of nematodes, probably the vast majority, do not harm us in any way. They're just living, doing their stuff in the environment, free living in the soil, free living in water. They are then going to eat bacteria and algae and other single-celled small things from the environment. There's some very interesting examples of nematodes. There are some very interesting model organisms. Not quite sure how to pronounce this guy, but C. elegans is an interesting example. Whenever you grow a C. elegans into an adult, you always get 959 cells, and those cells always do the same thing. So this is a real kind of key to the puzzle of development and cell organization. So we are, I guess, interested in the ones who do cause diseases. We're interested in the parasitic helminths. And our example is going to be Ascaris lumbricoides. Causes a disease called ascariasis. It's the most common roundworm disease. It's a pretty gross disease because females of Ascaris lumbricoides, they can reach 45 centimeters. So estimate about that big, about half a meter. And they are intestinal parasites. So imagine having a bunch of these big, nasty-looking worms living in your intestines. A female can release 200,000 eggs per day into the intestinal tract. So on to slide 11. They have an unusual infectious cycle. Worms are ingested, indeed worm eggs are ingested from a contaminated environment. The worm is swallowed and it winds up in the intestines. In the intestines, the eggs hatch, and the worm wriggles out of the intestine and into the bloodstream. It then circulates around the bloodstream until it winds up in the lungs. And then as it is circulating the alveoli, it leaves the blood vessels and enters the lung. It then wriggles its way and is coughed up. It is then swallowed once again, and then it makes its way back into the intestines, and it's in the intestines where the adult worms develop, and they have sexual reproduction. Again, there are male and female worms, and then they produce tons and tons and tons of eggs. Obviously, this is interesting because the worm is already in the intestines when it gets eaten. The eggs are eaten, they get to the intestines, and it would be interesting to know why it requires this kind of secondary route of getting into the blood, getting into the lung, and then being coughed up and swallowed. So these are sterilized worms that have been reclaimed from an unfortunate sufferer from ascariasis. Some of the nasty details are that in a very serious infection, you go to bed and you wake up and there are worms in your bed because the worms have wriggled out of your anus and they are now wriggling around with you. And you can imagine having this quantity of worms in your intestines is going to cause lots and lots of nasty symptoms. Okay, on to slide 12. We have our helminths. Again, we have what we call tapeworms, or also known as cestodes, also known as flatworms in many cases, because if you have your worm, if you were to cut the worm across and look at its cross section, it would be a flat configuration. I guess before I move on too much, let's just talk about what the worms are gaining. They are basically sitting in your intestines and they are absorbing the nutrients. So they are, so let's get back to the idea of the parasite nature. What are they doing? They are stealing your resources. I mentioned that a little bit earlier on. Sitting there, stealing your resources, basically turn those resources into more worms and more eggs, and the host, the human host in this case, is being negatively affected. The parasite is gaining, it's gaining a place to live, and it's stealing nutrients. The host is being negatively affected. Lots of symptoms of discomfort and vomiting and all kinds of stuff. And the host is having its nutrients robbed. And that's really that's really what these helminths are up to. They are inside your intestinal tract a lot of the time, and they are just stealing your nutrients. And that's also very true of the tapeworms, these flatworms. Again, you cut them and they have this flat cross section. These tapeworms can grow and grow and grow. And they grow by adding these sections. These sections called proglottids. These are worms that do not have a digestive system at all. All they do is absorb nutrients through their body. So they have this head end called a scolex. The scolex has hooks and suckers. Now, these aren't mouths or anything like that. These are attachment mechanisms. So they attach themselves. The head attaches itself in your small intestine, and then the rest of the worm, all of these proglottid sections just kind of hang, and through that process they are just absorbing nutrients. The proglottids, each one contains a complete male and complete female reproductive structure. So we can term these tapeworms hermaphrodites, and they can self-fertilize. So in each one of these proglottid segments, the worm can produce sperm, the worm can produce eggs, and it can fertilize its own eggs with its own sperm. It'll fertilize the eggs and sperm, and eggs will be expelled into the environment. Now, if two tapeworms were ever to get together in the same digestive tract, they could then exchange sperm and eggs. This method of self-fertilization is much more analogous to asexual reproduction, because there's no recombination of genetic material. But they can go through sexual reproduction if there's more than one worm present. The one worm can give sperm to this worm and fertilize its eggs, and this worm can give sperm to this worm and fertilize its eggs. So we can recognize a tapeworm through its body structure, this flat body structure, this flat ribbon-shaped body. No digestive system, simply lies there absorbing nutrients. Head end for attachment. The long segmented body, each segment a proglottid. Basically it is an egg laying factory, and it just sits there absorbing your nutrients and shedding eggs. Also, you can pass parts of the worm's body. This worm will break, and along with the eggs it'll shed proglottids. So here's another view of the tapeworm body, and here is one of those proglottid sections with its ovary and its testicles, complete male and complete female. So proglottid sections and worms are released into the environment. They are then taken up by an intermediate host. So we have sex and we have eggs inside the human. That makes the human the definitive host. We have another animal that is required for life cycle completion, and that's the intermediate host. The worm then implants cysts into the muscle of that animal, and then when we eat a piece of meat that has a cyst in it, particularly if that piece of meat hasn't been cooked properly, the cyst gets into our bodies, into our digestive systems, it hatches back into a new worm. And worms can live a very long time. There was a pretty gross idea not that long ago that if you wanted to lose weight, you could go to a doctor and you could be given a live cyst to ingest, to eat. And you would eat the cyst and the tapeworm would grow, and indeed it would work. You would lose weight, but I'm not sure anyone today would. First of all, it's dangerous. A very large tapeworm can have all kinds of negative side effects, not just stealing your nutrients. So once again, its idea is to steal your nutrients, turn those nutrients into more worms and more eggs. Our last kind of helminth is a fluke or a trematode. These typically have this kind of flat leaf-shaped structure, but they can have these other kind of funky shapes too. Okay, so flukes. Flukes are quite closely related to tapeworms in that they too have, if you were to cut across the body, you would see a flat cross section. They do have I've talked about the digestive mechanism of the other two, so let's talk about the digestive mechanism of the flukes. They just have the one opening. They have one opening, and they have an intestinal tract. So the food goes in, it gets digested and absorbed, and then the waste is released out of the same hole. They don't have a complete digestive system like we saw in the nematodes. They too, like the tapeworms, have a sucker, and that sucker is for attachment. And once again, they get to where they want to be, they attach there, and then they just kind of hang out, and they absorb the fluids and nutrients from the host. Blood flukes are a common cause of schistosomiasis. So schistosomiasis is a very important disease. This is a picture of the schistosomiasis worms here. This is the male worm, and this little one is the female worm. And when they get together in the digestive tract, they kind of stick together as a pair, and basically they are just egg-laying machines. So many millions of people affected with schistosomiasis, many thousands of people dying from it. We looked at the life cycle of schistosomiasis before. That's the one that requires, well, one of many that requires this intermediate so they require the snail. The human is, if we go back to our host definitions, the human is the definitive host, the snail is the intermediate host. So once the larvae penetrate the skin, the larvae move to the liver, and that's where they mature. From the liver, they migrate to the blood vessels around the intestines. So this is now outside the intestine. The female lays eggs in the blood vessels, and this is where this worm is pretty tricky. The worm relies on our inflammatory response to come along and to damage the blood vessel and for the eggs to be able to leave the blood vessel and enter the intestine. The eggs are released into the intestines and are excreted with feces. And then the larvae develop in the water. They are taken up by the snail host, and then inside the snail, parts of the life cycle of the worm occur, and the larvae are released from the snail, and they again reinfect the human. So these guys are in the blood. They are hanging out in the blood, sucking up nutrients, as opposed to our tapeworms hanging out in the intestines and sucking up nutrients. So, Ascaris lumbricoides, that guy is a nematode. Pathway of infection is actually in the textbook on page 327. Swallowed, hatch, burrow into blood, move to lung, burrow out of blood into the lung, coughed up and swallowed, back into the intestine, grow and make eggs. The parts of a tapeworm. The head of the tapeworm, the scolex, the segments of the tapeworm, the proglottids, inside the proglottids, complete male and complete female reproductive systems capable of self-fertilization and production of large number of eggs. Hermaphrodite means it has both male and female, full male and female reproductive structures. Schistosomiasis is caused by a trematode or a fluke. Its pathway of infection: the larvae penetrate, mature in the liver, get into the blood, find their way to the blood vessels around the intestines. The male and female form these pairs. The male and female going through sexual reproduction and producing lots and lots of eggs. The eggs in the blood around the intestines. Immune response against those eggs causes damage. That allows the eggs to leave the blood and enter the intestines. Then the eggs are released with the feces. Eggs hatch and they infect snails. A part of the life cycle is completed in the snail, back to the infectious burrowing cercariae that get back into the human.